This is Mishnah in depth. Nazir. This is also Nazir and Sotah. Today we have the pleasure of learning for the third time with Avie Walfish. This Mishnah in depth series is a project of Drisha's Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah division and is sponsored in her memory. For those who haven't had the pleasure of learning with him, Avie Walfish is a very experienced rabbi and teacher. He has headed the Halachic Beit Midrash at the Beit Hillel Urban Organization. He holds smicha from Yeshiva University, and also Rabbi Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg has completed his PhD at Hebrew University and written extensively and had the privilege of receiving the prize of the Israel Ministry of Education in 2015. Mishnah in depth is designed to accompany the daily Mishnah Yomi schedule and independent study of Mishnah. We are meeting weekly with the assumption that you have learned some of Mishnah Yomi on your own. Sources for today's class will be posted in chat, both on Facebook and on Zoom. We do want to hear your questions, and if you have them, please speak out. If you are on Zoom, I will send invitations to panelists. That way you can unmute yourself, speak directly, turn on the camera. But if you want to stay an attendee, that's fine. I will monitor chat and unmute you on request. And if you are joining on Facebook, I am monitoring chat again. And with that, I want to hand over to Rabbi Walfish.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's you say in Hebrew, the Asher Kav. Okay, in other words, to make sure we're all on the same page. First, let me just mention that as a result of this class, I have the privilege of, for the first time ever, fulfilling a particular halacha, which is not to cancel a regularly scheduled Torah class in order to first do B'dikat Chametz. Okay, normally B'dikat Chametz comes before virtually anything else that one does, but if you have a regular Torah class, that takes precedence, so the B'dikat Chametz will be put off for a bit. Okay, so what we discussed, among other things, in our previous two classes, especially last class, is the way in which the Torah and Chazal in the Mishnah evaluate the Nazir. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Okay, and we saw that there's a basis for both. The fact that the references to Shimshon in the first chapter were tended very much towards the negative aspects of Shimshon's character. It seemed to indicate that being a Nazir is not necessarily the greatest thing in the world. On the other hand, we saw the Torah does call a Nazir kadosh, okay, and so that would seem to indicate something more positive. Just wanted to share with you a couple of sources, not in the Mishnah, but from halachic midrashim, meaning midrashim that were compiled at the same time as the Mishnah. Okay, the Mishnah was compiled around 200 CE, the end of the period of the Tanaim. Tanaim really means sages of the Mishnah, and these same sages also compiled works of midrashim, okay, of midrash, focused more on the halachic, not only, but they've come to be called halachic midrashim. So the halachic midrash that's relevant to the discussion of Nazir is from the Sifrei Bamidbar. Okay, this is a work attributed to the school of Rabbi Yishmael, okay, who was a sage, a colleague of Rabbi Akiva, and his disciples are the ones who compiled this midrash called the Sifrei. And if we look at the Sifrei, we can see these different ways of approaching the Nazir. So let's just briefly take a look at these two midrashim. V'chiper alav me'asher chata al hanafesh. Okay, the pasuk is actually talking about a Nazir who has been defiled, and so he has to interrupt his Nazirut. We'll be talking more about that later on, from the Mishnayot of chapters 3 and 4, especially chapter 3. He has to interrupt his Nazirut, purify himself, and after 7 days of purification, then he shaves off his hair and brings sacrifices in order to restart his Nazirut. One of the sacrifices he brings is a korban asham, okay, which we usually translate as a blame offering. It might be, some scholars translate as a reparation offering, but be that as it may, it's for purposes of atonement, and particularly atonement when something sacred has been contaminated in some way, okay, or profaned. And when he brings these korbanot, the Torah employs this phrase, "V'chiper alav me'asher chata al hanafesh." Okay, he has to purify, he has to atone for himself for having sinned. Now, al hanefesh is a somewhat ambiguous term. The pshat seems to be he sinned by coming into contact with a soul, meaning a dead soul. Okay, in other words, he came into contact with a dead body of a human being. That's the pshat. But as we'll see, Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, who was a contemporary of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, in other words, this is from the generation of the compilation of the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar Omer, V'chial ezo nefesh chata zeh shetzarich kapara. Which soul did he sin to that he requires atonement? What did he do that was bad? He made himself a Nazir. Isn't that a good thing? Al shetzier nafsho min hayai, because he has afflicted himself by abstaining from wine. V'lo dvarim kal v'chomer. Okay, so this kal v'chomer argument, if someone who has refrained only from wine requires atonement, kal v'chomer nafsho al kol davar. Okay, so kal v'chomer, someone who would abstain from all pleasures. Okay, in other words, is a very clearly anti-ascetic strain. Okay, and he sees a Nazir as a kind of ascetic. Since the Nazir, his vow involves abstaining from wine, that's a form of asceticism, and you have to atone for that. Okay, God wants people to take pleasure in His world, to avail themselves of the pleasure of the world, of course, in the right proportions. You have to exercise moderation as well, but he certainly does not want abstention. Okay, and therefore, by becoming a Nazir, you have sinned, because it's a form of asceticism. As you can well imagine, this passage has attracted a tremendous amount of attention. First of all, the Talmud, it's quoted several times, okay, as expressing this negative evaluation of a Nazir, and of course, contemporary scholars have discussed this extensively in back and forth debates as to how pro or anti-ascetic were the sages or the sages at the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud. But certainly here you have a very clear presentation. He is very clearly anti-Nazir. Okay, a Nazir requires atonement. In other words, the atonement he's bringing is not so much for having defiled himself as for having put himself in the situation where defiling himself would be a sin. He has to atone for that. Okay, you shouldn't put yourself in that situation. Be like everybody else. Enjoy the world like everybody else. If you need to, you can come into contact with the dead, okay, like everybody else. You shouldn't set yourself apart and sort of put yourself outside of the normal run of how human beings behave. Okay, that is considered to be improper by Rabbi Lezer HaKapar. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, the Nazir Tameh Katuv in there. Rabbi Yishmael basically takes us back to the pshat of the pasuk. He says, no, the Torah is not talking about sinning against his soul by adopting ascetic practices. It's talking about sinning against his Nazirut by defiling himself through the dead. And so there's no negative evaluation of the Nazir at all in this passage. Then another very famous passage, which you really can't study Masechet Nazir without having some acquaintance with this passage, also a very, very extensively discussed passage, and particularly in contemporary research, there's a lot of back and forth. There are actually a lot of problems in understanding this passage, which we're not going to get into, but we're just going to, pull out one or two central ideas from the passage. Amar Shimon HaTzadik, which is already very, very interesting. Okay, Shimon HaTzadik was a very, very early figure within the Mishnah. We were familiar with him from Pirkei Avot as Mishiarei HaKnesset HaGdola. Okay, he was one of the remnants of the men of the Great Assembly, okay, which is the court which, according to tradition, led spiritually and probably also politically the Jewish people at the time of Shivat Zion. Okay, Ezra and Nehemiah, who are considered by tradition to be leading members of this group called Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, which, according to tradition, operated for 150, 200 years. And towards the end of this period, okay, which, again, according to tradition, Shimon HaTzadik lived at the same time as Alexander the Great, which puts him, around the last third of the 4th century BCE. Okay, there's an Agadic narrative which actually has an encounter between Shimon HaTzadik and Alexander the Great. So Shimon HaTzadik, quite early on in Second Temple period, okay, who now declares, Lo achalti asham nazirot me'olam. I never ate this sacrifice. The sacrifice that a Nazir who's been defiled has to bring as part of his restart. I never ate that. I never had the opportunity to eat that, or I never took the opportunity to eat that. Ela echad, except for once. Sheba echad min ad-darom, yefei einayim v'tov ro'il kfutzotav taltalim. So some young, strapping young lad, okay, very handsome, very good looking, okay, and long curly hair. Namti lo ma ra'ita lashchit sayar na'eh. So I said to him, what possessed you to destroy this beautiful hair? Okay, now, on the one hand, you have a sense that maybe one of the things that might motivate a Nazir, again, it seems to be in a kind of aesthetic mode, is that a person wants to destroy his hair. In other words, he wants to, at the end of the Nazirut, he wants to be bald. Okay, normally it's halachically problematic to give yourself a baldy haircut. Okay, but if you're a Nazir, okay, then it actually becomes a mitzvah. Okay, so he might want to become a Nazir in order to divest himself of this beautiful hair. And he says, what possessed you? In other words, he again seems to be anti-ascetic. Okay. Namti lo, marait ashkit venamli, and he answered me, Ro'eh hayiti be'iri, valachti lemalot mayim min ha'mayan, v'nistakalti bebavua sheli. Okay, pachaz alai bikesh la'avireni min ha'olam. Okay, I was a shepherd, and I came to draw water from a spring, and I saw my reflection, and my heart, okay, my heart began to incite me, okay, and to try to remove me from this world. Now, of course, it's clear that this story is playing off of a very well-known story from outside Jewish tradition, namely, excuse me, Rumel, you're muted.
Mel, I can unmute you if you need some help.
Is it Oedipus?
Not Oedipus, but you're right. You're in the right ballpark. Okay, it's
Okay.
from Greek mythology. Not Oedipus, but Narcissus.
Narcissus. Okay, thank you.
That's right. Right. Okay. This is where our contemporary word narcissistic or narcissism comes from. It's from the myth of Narcissus, who sees his reflection, okay, in a well, I believe it is, okay, and he falls in love with it, okay, and he becomes so inseparable from it that in the end he falls into the well, and there he is. He is there in that well. Okay, so there's this whole myth about this person who falls in love with his own image. Okay, so clearly we have a similar idea, but the Jewish version of that story gives it this twist. Okay, he says, I understood that this was the evil urge, okay, that was trying to remove me from the world, probably from the world to come. Okay, namti lo rasha, הרי אתה מתגאה בשאינו שלך, של עפר ושל רימה ושל תולעהו. הריני מגלחך לשמיים. Okay, you're so vainglorious about something that doesn't belong to you. Okay, because these good looks are so ephemeral. Okay, this is flesh and blood that will rot in the ground. Okay, so what are you so proud of? And therefore, what am I going to do with this beautiful hair that is so sorely tempting me to be Narcissus and fall in love with myself? What can I do? I will shave it off, but not just to shave it off. I will shave it off for the honor of God. Now, this gives us a very interesting perspective on Nazirut, that one of the things that a person might want to do when he becomes a Nazir, he might be less concerned with what he goes through for the 30 or 60 or 90 days, however long it is, that he observes the laws of Nazirut and doesn't cut his hair and doesn't drink wine and doesn't defile himself through contact with the dead. Actually, he might be more focused on the end game. The end game of the Nazir is to bring sacrifices and include among those sacrifices his hair. His hair becomes a kind of sacrifice. He says, this hair that is so dangerous to me spiritually, I'm going to make a sacrifice of it to God, and that will sanctify it. Okay, so it's like taking the evil urge and sanctifying it, a very profoundly Jewish idea. Okay, and miyad machti et roshi uneshaktiv al rosho namti lo kemotcha yirbu b'Yisrael. Okay, I see the hand. I'll give you an opportunity in a moment. Kemotcha yirbu b'Yisrael osim ritzon hamakom v'lechen itkayem ish o isha ki yaflilu lindor neder nazir. And of course, the key words here are lahazir lashem. And Nazirut is for the greater honor and glory of God. Okay, so Shimon HaTzadik said, this is a Nazir who got it right. As you see that he he's opposed to Nazirut because most people don't have the right motivation. But this one who has a pure and holy motivation, he is truly a man who has sanctified himself and particularly his hair to God, and therefore he gives that a positive evaluation. Okay, so these are just two representative examples of negative evaluation of a Nazir, Rabbi Eliezer HaKapar, and positive evaluation, at least in certain cases, by Shimon HaTzadik. Yes, Deborah, please.
I always thought that the idea of giving it to Hashem along those lines of Rav Shimon HaTzadik is to take it, and I did nothing to warrant the hair. The hair was from Hashem. So therefore, I'm returning it to Hashem. In other words, I can work on my midot. I can work on my inner stuff, but the outer is totally from God. So if that is something that could machshil me, the way that I can atone for anything negative is to return it to the one who gave it to me.
Okay, I would agree with almost everything you said except for the word atone. I don't think there's any theme of atonement. Okay. There's an idea here of elevation, but I don't know if it goes quite so. You're taking it in a dualistic direction. Like a kind of divorce between the physical and the spiritual. And I think it's more. I think it's a bit more nuanced here. I don't think it's quite that dualistic, and I think there is an idea here of elevating the physical, not just acknowledging that the physical comes from God and therefore I am returning it to God, but by returning to God, I'm also elevating it. I think there is that. I think there's that aspect of it here as well. Okay, so that's that would be my only cavil with what you said. I think the direction is correct, but I would just fine tune it a little bit. Okay. Yes. Okay. One further point growing out of our previous classes, the Torah talks a lot about what the Nazir is not supposed to do. There is no place where the Torah tells us what the Nazir is supposed to do. For all we know, the Nazir lives a normal life, with the exception that he has to separate himself from those things. Now, I believe that one who abstains from wine and refrains from taking a haircut and has to go to extreme lengths to avoid contact with the dead is going to put himself out of a lot of social circles. Okay? The social circles will be people who drink together. Social circles outside of funerals will also involve, maybe visiting the sick. If you have to be very careful to stay away from dead, you're also limiting your social circle. And if you're growing your hair long, I think that's also a way of people looking at you and saying, you're not one of us. You're set apart somehow. Nezer, okay, both the word lahazir and the word nezer, which are the two meanings of the root nun zayin reish, both have the idea of setting apart. So I think the Nazir naturally will be somewhat apart from society, but he doesn't have to be apart from society. He can interact with people. He can go to work. He can more or less live a normal lifestyle with certain limitations. Okay, but the question is that what the Torah is envisioning, or are these practices supposed to be to cultivate some kind of, let's say, monastic lifestyle or something, that's sort of completely focused on divine service? That question in turn might depend on the difference between the different kinds of Nazir that we saw, particularly in chapter 1. The temporary Nazir will very likely be focused more on what Deborah was talking about before, Tikkun HaMidot, performing a particular act of service of God for a defined period of time, by abstaining from certain things and sort of ratcheting up your level of sanctity. Okay, so you're somehow like working on yourself, trying to improve yourself in a spiritual way. I think a temporary Nazirut would probably incline more in that direction. So you can live a normal lifestyle, but you've got something in your way of life that is moving you in a direction of becoming a more complete spiritual personality. The lifetime Nazir, okay, very likely in my book would be somebody who's more along the lines of what we saw in the prophet Amos, the kind of Nazir who is a man of God, almost akin to a prophet. He's also a kind of man of God, or in the Torah, he's akin to a Kohen. Okay, so a Nazir as a kind of spiritual functionary. Okay, in modern Hebrew, we call him a Kli Kodesh. Okay, someone who is devoted entirely to the service of God. So I think you can probably find both of these models of Nazir, and that very well might be the difference between the different kinds of Nazir described in chapter 1. Okay, okay, let's move now into chapter 3. Okay, our 2 chapters for this week are Prakim Gimel and Dalid. Okay, so let's take a look. Okay, let's get the text up here. Okay, does everyone see the text here? Svaria? Everyone has it?
I can just see what you have open in Word.
Oh, okay. So I'll have to stop share and start a new share. Okay, so let's get that. Here it is. Okay, now you should all see it, right?
Yes.
Okay. So okay, let's look at the first few Mishnayot. We'll read them quickly. I'll just read the Hebrew. Anyone who needs the English, you've got the English here up on the screen. Mishamar Reini Nazir Megaleach Yom 31 V'Imgilach Liyom 30 Yatza. Hareini Nazir 30 Yom Imgilach Liyom 30 Lo Yatza. Misha Nazar Shtei Naziriyot Megaleach et harishona Yom 31 ואת השנייה יום 61. ומגילח את הראשונה יום 30, מגלח את השנייה יום 60. ומגילח יום 60 חסר אחת, at 59, okay, יצא. וזו עדות העיד רבי פפיאס, על מי שנזר 2 נזיריות, שמגילח את הראשונה 30 יום, מגלח את השנייה יום 60, ומגילח יום 60 חסר אחד, יצא. שיום 30 עולה לו מן המניין. Third Mishnah, משאמר הריני נזיר נטמא יום 30 סותר את הכל. רבי אליעזר אומר אינו סותר אלא 7. הריני נזיר 30 יום, נטמא יום 30 סותר את הכל. And finally, for now, הריני נזיר 100 יום, נטמא יום 100 סותר את הכל. רבי אליעזר אומר אינו סותר אלא 30. נטמא יום 101 סותר 30 יום. רבי אליעזר אומר אינו סותר אלא 7. Okay, now clearly there's something that all 4 Mishnayot have in common, which is why I read them all together, but it's going to break down into 2 groups of 2. What all these Mishnayot have in common is they all talk about something that happens when
You say you're going to be for longer, and then something happens in the shorter. when you aggregate more?
Well, not exactly. That's not what these Mishnah are talking about. That is definitely an issue, but that's not what these Mishnah are talking about. These Mishnah are dafka talking about something happens on the day of, on the last day of the period that you took upon yourself. Now, let's go back and look. Okay, the first Mishnah is talking about when you're a Nazir, so you should shave on the 31st day, because we've already learned in the first chapter, Stam Nazirut Shloshim Yom. Okay, the standard time frame for Nazirut is 30 days. And the assumption, there are drashot that try to derive this from the psukim, but the basic idea seems to be a minimal growth, to call it gadel peras or rosho. His hair is growing wild. What does it mean for your hair to grow wild? 30 days. Less than 30 days cannot be called growing your hair wild. Okay, so if a Nazir has observed fewer than 30 days, he hasn't done one of the main things the Nazir is supposed to do, namely to grow his hair wild. Okay, so Nazir is 30 days. So the Mishnah starts off by telling us the shaving should be on the 31st day. Okay, that makes sense. But then it says, but if you shave on the 30th day, you have fulfilled your command. In other words, the 30th day itself is a day where at least b'diavad, okay, it's not the preferred time, which is the chatchila, but b'diavad, if you did it, it works. You can do it if you shave on the 29th day, so you have violated a prohibition and you have not completed your nazirut. You'll have to start regrowing your hair so that you can complete it with a head of hair that can be shaved off. But if you shave it on the 30th day, so you did it. Okay, now the Talmud identifies this with an idea called miktzat hayom kichulo. Okay, part of a day is like a whole day. Okay, from where are we generally familiar with this idea that if you observe something for part of a day, it's as though you observed the whole day?
Fasting?
Fasting, actually not. Fasting, if you observe only part of the day, you didn't really fast.
Saying the Shema,
Saying the Shema doesn't have to fill up a day. Talking about something that's to fill up an entire day, something you should be observing for a whole day, but if you observe part of the day, that counts. Okay, the area, I mean, I suppose I should be happy that people aren't identifying this because it's not a happy event. The area is Avelut. Okay? When you observe Shiva, the Shiva starts on the day of the funeral, starts after the funeral, but the day of the funeral is considered to be the first day, which
And
is
if you
why
just sit for if you sit for an hour, it counts.
not even an hour. You can sit for a minute. If you have a funeral late in the day, so whoever is conducting the funeral will generally work very hard to ensure that the funeral ends before sunset, so that the Avelim can go away from the grave, move away from the grave, take off their shoes, sit down on the ground or on a step or whatever, okay, and have people come and offer them condolences. That's enough. Enough to do that for a minute, and that day counts as the first day of the Shiva. And the last day of the Shiva is until the morning, usually right after Shacharit. Right after Shacharit, again, someone will come and will offer consolation to the to the mourners and say, okay, your Shiva is over. So the first day and the last day are both Miktat Hayom Kichulo. The same thing with Shloshim, by the way. We do the same thing with Shloshim, okay? The first day of the Shloshim is the day of the funeral, okay? And the last day of the Shloshim also, you can stop observing the laws of Shloshim early in the day. You don't have to wait till the end of the day. Now, that's where we're usually familiar with this from, but here's a Torah model for this idea. Okay, the Nazir on the 30th day, since he entered the day with his hair still growing and it hasn't been cut, he can shave it at that point, and that will count as his head shaving, which also means he can bring his sacrifices on that day. Okay, that's the first law that we have here. Okay, however, there's an exception. Okay, excuse me. Yeah. If, however, he says, okay, the Mishnah continues, if he explicitly took upon himself a Nazirut of 30 days, then if he shaves his head on the 30th day, that doesn't count. Okay, we'll come back in a bit to discuss why this difference. Okay, then the next Mishnah applies this to when he has two Naziruyot back to back. Okay, so the first Nazirut, he should shave on the 31st day, but he could shave on the 30th day. And then the next Nazirut starts on the day that he shaved. So the second Nazirut, okay, if he shaved on the 31st day, so the 60th day will be the 30th day of the second Nazirut, and he can shave on the 61st day. But if he shaves on the 60th day, that will work. Okay, and as the Mishnah continues, and if the first Nazirut, he shaved on the 30th day, so then the 60th day is the preferred day to shave for the second Nazirut, and it could even be on the 59th day. Okay, and as Rav Papias testifies, this is an interesting formulation, which we can't get into right now, but when a rabbi testifies, in other words, he brings a tradition that he has. There's a tractate in the Mishnah devoted to testimonies of this sort, and this testimony of Rabbi Papias appears there as well in tractate Eduyot. Okay, so he notes that point. Okay, Yom Shishim Chaser Achad. Okay, can even be on the 59th day if he jumps the gun both times, and then it works. Okay, then we move to Mishnah Gimel, and now we're not talking about shaving on the 30th day, but being defiled on the 30th day, coming into contact with the dead on the 30th day. Now, as opposed to shaving doesn't interrupt your Nazirut, but it does require you, if it's done in the middle of your period of Nazirut, it requires you to grow your hair again so that you'll have what to shave off when you end the Nazirut. But when you're defiled through the dead, that interrupts the Nazirut. That's what's called Sotah. Okay? It's called here, negates the entire tally. That's how he translates Sotah. Sotah literally means to dismantle. Okay? To undo. It undoes everything he's done. He's got to restart the whole Nazirut from scratch. And again, he has to have 7 days of purification, shaving, sacrifices, and then start his Nazirut a second time until he completes a full 30-day term. Now, what if he becomes defiled on the 30th day? So Tanakama says, Sotera Takol. He's still in his period of Nazirut. Okay, even though theoretically he could have shaved before he did that, but he didn't. So he's still in his period of Nazirut. Rabbi Eliezer says no. On the 30th day, if he becomes defiled, since he could have ended his Nazirut had he wanted to on that day, so he is, even though he hasn't fully concluded the Nazirut, but he's not fully part of it either. And therefore, he doesn't have to restart the whole thing all over again. He can just grow his hair a minimal period of 7 days so that he can have the shaving off part of the concluding ceremony. But he hasn't defiled his Nazirut. The 30th day is already, it's a kind of limbo. It's, for these purposes, it's after his Nazirut has been concluded. Okay? But again, if he says, Hareini Nazir Shloshim Yom, so then, until the end of the 30th day, he is part of that period of Nazirut. Okay? And then the next Mishnah continues with that. This time, if he says, not I am a Nazir for 30 days, I'm a Nazir for 100 days. Okay? So this is not a standard 30-day period of Nazirut. He has defined it as being a longer period, 100 days. So then, Nitma Yom Me'ah Soter Takol, and once again, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it doesn't undo everything, doesn't negate everything. But here, since he defined it as he defined it and he designated 100 days, so even though it doesn't negate all 100 days, but now he has to have a full 30-day after he purifies himself and starts regrowing his hair, he has to observe at least a full 30-day Nazirut. Because the first 70 days count. It's only the last 30 days that have been nullified as a result of his becoming impure. Okay?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, for sure.
Realistically, though, when it says that he has to, you take off 7 days or something, and then you cut his hair, how much hair can grow in 7 days? Or what?
Well,
where are we counting from?
Not all that much, but enough to be considered to be shaving your head. See,
so they shave his head
shave
after
off
the
a Nazir head of hair, you need 30 days.
right.
But the person, okay, according to Rabbi Eliezer, this is all within Rabbi Eliezer's frame of reference. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if you became defiled on the 30th day, when
had they shaved his hair already?
Say you're beyond your period of Nazirut, so then we say, in order to perform the shaving off the hair ceremony, it's enough to have a minimal growth of hair of 7 days and not a full Nazirut head of hair of 30-day growth.
So they assume they shaved his hair already and then he became
Yes, because that's part of his purification. When he purifies himself, he has to shave off the hair that became defiled and then start regrowing it. Since his hair became defiled at a point where he was already sort of with 1 foot out the door of his Nazirut, so Rabbi Eliezer says it's enough to have 7 days. I'll just note in passing that this version of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion has been disputed. There are several parallel sources, and there are different texts of the parallel sources, and contemporary scholars have had a field day debating whether that's really what Rabbi Eliezer said. But we're going to stick with our text, okay? We're going to read it that way, the way we have the text in front of us. Okay?
So let's say somebody became defiled, let's say on day 25 of his 30 day.
He has to press restart on his whole Nazirut.
So he starts over from day 1 altogether.
Starts over from day 1. That everyone agrees.
So would he shave his head altogether, or he would keep it and grow
Yes,
another
yes,
30?
he 7-day purification, at the end of which he brings sacrifices which involve shaving off all of the hair on his head, okay? And then he's got to start his Nazirut all over from scratch.
But he wouldn't shave it on the 30th day. He would shave it on the end of the 7th.
That's right.
I see. Okay.
Okay. Okay. And everyone also agrees at the end of Mishnah Dalid, Nitma Yom Me'av Echad, if he's the father on the 101st day, so then everyone agrees that he doesn't have to restart the whole 100 days. But again, and this is our text once again, the sages say that the Tanakama, that you have to have 30 days. Rabbi Eliezer said, the way Rabbi Eliezer said in the previous case. Rabbi Eliezer in this case knocks it down a notch and says 7-day growth would be enough in that particular case. Okay, so now let's try to zero in on the issues here. Okay, so okay, so we've already said what impurity does. The way the Torah formulates it is Timei Rosh Nizro. Okay, his head of hair becomes defiled. His head of hair is his crown. Nezer Elohav al Rosho. That has been defiled through contact with the dead. And therefore, you have to shave it off and start it all over again. That's normally. But if he successfully concluded the period, which according to Rabbi Eliezer he has done, if it happens on the 30th day or on the 100th day, okay, so then Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, so then we're not so strict with him. So then we can say he's concluded it, but in order to be able to carry out the shaving part of his end of Nazirut ceremony, he needs at least a 7-day growth of hair. Okay, so that's one issue. What does impurity require? Okay, now we've also said a second issue is what is the status of the last of these days. Now here, let's take a look at some parallel sources to appreciate what the Mishnah is teaching us here. Okay, these are sources that if you oh, I think I forgot to put these sources up. Okay, I'll just tell you the sources. They should actually be familiar to you because we read them in the Torah yesterday. Okay, so if anyone was following along with the Torah reading, not just listening, but also understanding, then okay, then you would pick this up. There are other places where a person has to count a certain period of time and then bring sacrifices. Okay, and we read about two of them in yesterday's Parshat Mitzorah. One of them is the Mitzorah. The other one is Tumat Zav. Okay, different kinds of emissions. Okay, sexually related emissions for men or for women. Okay, and part of their purification procedure is to bring sacrifices. Now, what the Torah says is the Mitzorah, when the Kohen comes and says, okay, he's been healed, then he starts a purification process. And the purification process starts with a bird ceremony, 2 birds, one of them is slaughtered, the other one is dipped in its blood, set free. Then he counts 7 days. And then on the 8th day, he brings his sacrifices, which complete his purification process. The same thing with the Zav. The Zav or the Zavah have to count 7 clean days when the emissions cease. They count 7 clean days. At the end of the 7 clean days, they bring their sacrifices for purification on the 8th day. And now, what do we see? Everyone agrees that for a Nazir, even though it's preferable to bring them on the 31st day, okay? Take a look here. You have up on the screen, we have psukim. Kol yemei neder nizro ta'ar lo yavor al rosho ad milot hayamim asher yazir lashem kadosh yeh gadel perasa rosho. Until the end of the days that he has vowed to God, he shall be sanctified to grow his hair wild. So, how long does he have to grow his hair before he shaves it? 30 full days. Ad melot yemei nizro, 30 full days. So that's why he can only shave on the 31st day. But there's another pasuk. V'zot Torat HaNazir. This is the procedure for ending Nazirut. Biyom melot yemei nizro yavi oto al petach oel moed. On the day that his term of Nazirut ends, he shall bring his sacrifices to the opening of the tent of meeting. So when does he bring his sacrifices, which include shaving? On the day it ends. So we seem to have a conflict. On the one hand, he's supposed to grow his hair until the very end of the term, the end of the 30th day. On the other hand, on the day his term ends, on the 30th day, he brings his sacrifices and shaves his hair. So, what did the Mishnah do with that conflict? Okay, you can see drashot on either of these psukim that illustrate that. We don't have time to look at them, but numbers 4 and 5, if you take a look at them on your own, you'll see that they both focus on those, one focuses on the one pasuk, the other on the other, and draw these two conclusions, but we saw it in the Mishnah already. Preferably, don't shave until the 31st day. But if you did it on the 30th day, it works. That's the compromise. Both psukim are correct. One of them is the preferred method. The other one is a possible method. Okay, so that's okay. So now my question is, but why is the Nazir different from the Mitzorah and from the Zav? There's no question. They must wait until the day after. They count 7 days, and then the day after they bring the sacrifices. The Nazir counts 30 days, and the 30th day, he could bring his sacrifices, and he could shave his hair. Why is the Nazir different? So let's look at it from both perspectives. Okay, first from the perspective of the Mitzorah and the Zav. Both of them are purifying themselves. The 7 days are necessary for the purification. The sacrifices can't be brought until the purification has reached its full term. 7 full days of purification, and only then is it possible to bring sacrifices. They can't be concomitant. When it comes to the Nazir, it seems that the sacrifices are not after he concludes his term. The sacrifices are what conclude his term. And I would even go so far as to say they're part of his term. And this brings me back to the point we noted in the story of Shimon HaTzadik and the Nazir from the south. Bringing the Nazir, bringing his hair, is not just how he ends his Nazirut, it's how he
does it.
brings his Nazirut to a climax.
It's
The
how he does
sacrifice-
it.
Yes, the sacrifices and the observance of the Nazirut are one. So you can look at it from two perspectives. You can say, I observe Nazirut for 30 days, and on the 31st day, I shave off my head as part of concluding the Nazirut. But you can also look at it as saying, I observed 30 days of Nazirut, and they in turn conclude with bringing my hair as part of a sacrificial proceeding. So it's not something separate and apart from the 30-day term. It's of a piece with the 30-day term. It's a continuum with the 30-day term. Mitzorah and Zav are a break. I was X, now I want to be Y. I was impure, now I am becoming pure. That has to be the next day. But I was an active Nazir, and now I am bringing my Nazirut to a climax by offering my hair as part of a sacrificial proceeding. It's all one continuum.
It's a culmination.
It's a culmination and not a break. Okay? So I think this Mishnah is very significant in terms of teaching us both something about what it means to shave the hair at the end of the Nazirut, okay, and something about the meaning of the term, the 30-day term, okay? So the 30th day is actually, it has two qualities. It concludes stage one, but it can also culminate and bring you to the whole process and bring you immediately to stage two. One exception to that is when you took a vow specifically of 30 days. And here, what seems to take over, and here we're coming to another theme that we've been emphasizing in Masechet Nazir. What you're emphasizing here is the power of the word. Nazir as a neder. Before we were talking about Nazir as a personal sanctity. The sanctity of the Nazir is expressed in a 30-day term and in offering his head. And the question is, what's the relationship between these two components of his personal sanctity? But there's also Nazir as a neder. Nazir is a status that I take upon myself through a vow of Nazirut. And here already that changes the equation. When my vow was 30 days means 30 days. I can't play around with that. When it's 30 days, because that's how the Torah defines my personal sanctity, the 30th day becomes a meeting point. When it's 30 days, because that's how I verbally defined it, the vow binds me. It has nothing to do now with personal sanctity. If I cut my hair on the 30th day, I violated my Nazirut. If I become defiled on the 30th day, I violated my Nazirut, because I defined it as being 30 full days. Okay, so the language of vow really changes the whole quality of the of that time measurement. Okay, let's make one more point about chapter 3, and I'm afraid I was hoping to get to chapter 4, but I see we'll have to put that off. We'll say a few words about chapter 4 next time, but let's say one more comment about chapter 3. Okay, we'll take 2-3 minutes on this. Okay, the Mishnah. Oh, that's chapter 4 already. Back to chapter 3. Yeah, here we go. Also within the time frame, the Mishnah talks about if you take a vow of Nazirut while you're in a cemetery. So then the Nazirut doesn't take effect because you're in a situation that negates the Nazirut. And if the Nazirut never started, it can't conclude. You can't count it. So the Nazirut simply has been suspended until you leave the cemetery. Once you leave the cemetery, it starts, and if you then re-enter the cemetery, so you have violated a Nazirut that started, and you treat it like any other Nazirut that started. And then the next Mishnah applies this in a very interesting way. A person takes a neder of Nazirut outside of Eretz Yisrael. Now, why is that significant? Outside of Eretz Yisrael is regarded halachically as having the halachic status of a cemetery. On a rabbinic level, it's not as stringent as a cemetery, but rabbinically, countries outside of the land of Israel are regarded as large cemeteries. Some sources relate that to the flood, okay? And there's a tradition that the flood didn't take place in Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael is free from that. But the world turned into a vast cemetery at the time of the flood. Or it might have to do with the fact that certainly at the time these halachot were formulated, the nations of the world were very warlike and belligerent. Okay, so maybe it has to do with that. Okay, whatever the reason might be for it, that was the rabbinic decree. So now the person took a neder nazirut. Since it's only rabbinically like a cemetery, the nazirut goes into effect. He is a nazir. But if he comes to Israel, he has to observe nazirut. He has to again observe his nazirut. The nazirut he observed in Chutz La'aretz doesn't count once he comes to Israel. Okay, but then the question is, well, what do you mean it doesn't count? It doesn't count at all? So Beit Shammai says, no, just observe another 30 days. You observed the nazirut of however long it was, and now observe a really proper nazirut. You've come to Israel, you're in a pure land, you can now observe it properly, so observe another 30 days. And Beit Hillel, interestingly, this is one of the examples where Beit Hillel is more stringent than Beit Shammai, says no, restart the whole nazirut all over again. Because the nazirut he did outside was fine as long as he remained outside. When he came to the land, he has to repeat it. And very interestingly, the Mishnah concludes that discussion with a historical account of an actual nazirut. We saw an earlier account from the time of Shimon HaTzadik, and here we see one from a very well-known figure indeed, Queen Helene, okay, the queen of I think it's called Adiabadna, I think it's called, okay, of a kingdom, I think it's somewhere near Armenia, okay, who is well known as becoming a convert, and a very pious convert at that. So she took a vow of Nazirut when she was at home, and then she came to Eretz Yisrael, okay, and she was required to repeat her Nazirut, okay, to carry out her Nazirut. She had taken Nazirut for 7 years, and she had to observe, according to Beit Hillel, another 7 years. So we see her time frame the same time as Beit Hillel, okay, which is 1st century CE. We see a very pious woman, okay, Queen Helene, okay, who was observing Nazirut and who ended up observing quite a few years of Nazirut, okay, and we have this, historical account, Now, there are another couple of points to make about her that we will discuss in the context of chapter 4. But I'll just give you a couple of points to think about in advance of the next class. Okay, the next class I won't be able to give on Sunday, so it will be pre-recorded. You'll get details about that a bit further on. Okay. Now, so a couple of things to think about. The model here of Heleni Hamalka, who is taking this neder nazirut if her son returns safely from war. That should remind you of a certain biblical story. And I'd like you to think about the relationship between the story here in the Mishnah and the biblical model. We'll talk about that. Okay, and this also gives an interesting motivation for becoming a Nazir, or in this case, a Nazirah, which will link up with different motivations that we saw last class in chapter 2. So we saw a few different motivations there. Here we see another interesting motivation here. Again, I want to discuss all of those things in connection with chapter 4. So we'll come back and discuss this Mishnah in the context of chapter 4. And the next class will be focusing on chapters 5 and 6. So I wish you all an Erev Tov and a Chag Kasher v'Sameach and B'Sarot Tovot and B'Sarot Shel Gula L'Am Yisrael.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, thank you.
Chag Sameach. And just to reiterate, we will not be meeting next Sunday. Unfortunately, we did not schedule the class at a time that is viable. Would be on Yantiv for Rabbi Walfish, which, not ideal. And then but we will be pre-recording a class in lieu of this session, and that link will go out to all of you. And and then I hope to see you all on Zoom the following week, not on the 28th, but on May 5th for the final chunk of Sotah of Nazir before we move on to Sotah. And with that, Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Thank you for coming, and thank you for learning.
Thank you.
Bye.